Hi, welcome to my mini lecture, What is Ecology? This is my summary of the first chapter in Ecology, a very short introduction. So what is ecology and what do ecologists study? First and foremost, a classic definition of ecology is the study of how organisms interact with their environment. A central goal of ecologists is to understand the abundance and distribution of organisms throughout a particular ecological space. We generally look at ecology at four main levels: organismal level, population level, community level, and ecosystem level. So these are sort of a hierarchy of how ecological studies are done. When we're looking at a population, we're concerned with a group of individuals of the same species living in the same area. On the other hand, if you're a community ecologist, you focus on species that interact in an area. They're not necessarily all the same species. And in an ecosystem, you're interested in all the organisms in an area plus abiotic components. And when we mean abiotic, we mean non-living, things like temperature and maybe the geography of a space. So the chapter starts by thinking about what does that eat? This classic question in ecology. And here's a nice little diagram of a boy fishing in an aquatic ecosystem, and you can see how different things are eating different things, and there's interactions within this ecosystem here. We're interested in ecological patterns, like what decides what organisms are where and how many organisms are there. So this is just an ecological pattern, say for example, of how different plants and shrubs are distributed in a community over time. So you can see that we have different aged organisms and we have different community types. So this is just an example of looking at patterns that we see in the environment. And those patterns can get quite complex and take a number of species into account over a particular sampled area and look at species distribution, but also species abundance over a particular ecological space. In this case, it would be a small area of a forest. It could also be looking at ecological factors that are important. So those could be abiotic or biotic factors. Some examples of biotic factors in this picture could be disease or predators. And some examples of abiotic factors here could be the limited space. Here's an example that they talked about in the book. These are the African fairy circles found in Namibia. And these would be a pattern that an ecologist would be interested in understanding why we see this pattern over a particular habitat. And for some time, I know that it was thought that this might be due to underground activity by subterranean termites. But actually, a paper has come out fairly recently in 2020 that actually sets out the hypothesis that this actually has to do with a particular species of plant that has hydrophobic, so water hating, and toxic latex, and that might be the reason that we see this particular pattern. Ecologists are also interested in how energy is transferred, and remember, energy is not lost, and we have a system in trophic levels that is basically set up as who eats who. And so this transfer of energy from one thing eating another is something that ecologists study. And remember that biomass is continually decreasing as we move up trophic levels. So this is where we get essentially the reduction of biomass because of energy transfer and heat loss. We can also look at an individual species and think about how they interact with their environment. So this is showing an output of a caterpillar, so feces, as we actually talk about it in an entomologist term, we would call it frass. And growth, that's basically how much leaf material is the caterpillar eating and how much of that actually ends up in actual weight of the caterpillar. And then, of course, cellular respiration, so that loss of CO2 by cellular respiration. So these are all different kinds of interactions with the environment. In one case, it was looking at multiple trophic levels. Here, we're just looking at one organism and its environment. So here's an example of a list of different kinds of ecological questions. So what kind of questions would be considered questions that ecologists ask? Say, for example, why do bees visit some types of flowers and not others? Or why are some fungi poisonous and others are not? Or why do insects avoid Scotch broom and they don't eat it? These are all examples of ecological questions. It's really important to remember that you can't really study ecology without thinking about evolution. And this is showing you an example of evolution of this hypothetical group of bugs. And remember that evolution is defined as biological change over time, or genetic change in a population over time. And as you can see, we have this population of bugs. And in the very beginning of the population, in the past, there were big blue bugs and little red bugs. And then over time, we see that these purpley bugs show up. And now, over time, we have a loss of the red bugs, and then we eventually have a complete dominance of the light blue bug. This is the change in what organisms are in, or what type of that same species of organism is in the population over time. So a change in a population over time. And in this case, we can see that change is from an actual big mix of different colored bugs. Remember, these are all the same species, and ending up in a very homogeneous population of all light blue bugs. Now, what is the mechanism for that? The mechanism that drives evolution, at least most of the time, is natural selection. And this is an example of a natural selection event. Here we have this predator, and the predator is then feeding on mice or attacking mice. So we have some of these mice eaten by birds. And as you can see, what's happening is more white or light colored mice are being eaten because maybe the predator can see those mice better. And over time, that means there are less of the light-colored mice in the population. So the selective force is that predation, and the result is that the frequency of that light-colored mouse changes over time. We get less of them over time. So a famous scientist once said that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. This is a famous quote by Dobzhansky. And this is really important to remember, is that when we're looking at ecology today, we're looking at what is the result of evolution, right? Because evolution has taken place over time, and we're looking at a snapshot in that evolutionary process. The way that it is described in the book is to talk about how does ecology relate to evolution? Well, if you think of a stage as being the environment, and the director of that performance that's going to be on the stage is natural selection, then ecology is actually that performance. And so ecology is what we're watching in real time. Evolution sort of shaped what we're going to see. Natural selection was part of that direction. And environment is really what we're seeing that performance take place in. Ecologists have a bit of physics envy because physics tends to follow very predictable patterns. It's very mathematical. So you can make an equation, or you can come up with an equation for principles in physics, and they're repeatable, they're the same, they're controllable. Well, it doesn't work that way for ecologists, unfortunately. Ecology can be very difficult to study because there's so many interactions that are associated with ecological questions. They're very, very diverse, and they change from location to location. So even looking at this from habitat to habitat can be extremely different. So it's important to take a more holistic approach and look at all those interacting parts and try to make predictions. But ecologists do use mathematics to help explain those patterns. So how do they use mathematics to explain those patterns? Well, they create different kinds of models from data that they collect to make predictions. So say, for example, if we're interested in species distribution here, you can make a model. So you have data collection, so you make species field observations, you take GIS maps, and then you use some computer processing and analysis to create statistical and dynamic modeling. So you use ecological niche modeling, and you can make spatial predictions and decide where would you expect that species to be distributed in other locations. So here, for example, probably created in a similar type of way, is a distribution map of the snowshoe hare here in Washington. And this is what our cute little snowshoe hare looks like. And it's distributed in Washington. All the green is habitat, and all the light sort of yellowishy tan color is potential habitat for the snowshoe hare. And a lot of this was made using those same types of techniques. And that's because we understand that organisms are not distributed evenly in space and time. Why is this? What might influence that distribution? These are the kinds of things that ecologists try to study. So what about ecology as a worldview? Is environmentalism different than ecology? Well, ecology is generally seen as the scientific study that informs the environmental policy. So environmentalism is that environmental policy. But there are a lot of ecologists that definitely are very policy oriented because it's becoming increasingly important to study ecology as we lose more organisms, as more habitat is being destroyed. So now I think that there's probably a lot more ecologists who at least spend some of their time with policy work or in helping to inform policy. And so Aldo Leopold said it best when he said, "We simply cannot call ourselves ecologists and be indifferent to the slaughter of the biota now becoming worldwide." So I think that that's something to remember, is that, yes, classically ecology is different than environmentalism, but increasingly those two are interacting quite a bit, which is appropriate for an ecologist. Thank you so much for watching.